In this training, we will discuss the Buy American provision. Buy American pertains to an agricultural commodity that is produced in the United States and a food product that is processed or manufactured in the United States, substantially using agricultural commodities that are produced in the U.S. Substantially is considered 51% of the food component is domestic. The Buy American provision requires SFAs participating in the NSLP to purchase domestic commodities or products to the maximum extent practicable. This is where you'll want to make sure you utilize your entitlement to procure USDA direct delivery foods to obtain canned fruits and vegetables that meet the Buy American requirements. Further processed items must also follow Buy American requirements as part of the USDA Foods Program. You can also use some of your entitlement on USDA DoD Fresh. If a food product is grown domestically in the U.S. and then shipped out of the U.S. for processing, then this item would not meet the Buy American requirements. A food component can be from another country of origin, but the processed item must contain, as discussed, at least 51% of a U.S. grown product. The label on the can or container should identify where the product is manufactured and what percent of the food component is U.S. grown. If the container only states the product is distributed from a supplier in the U.S. or has multiple countries of origin, with one being U.S., perhaps that's on some of your juices, for the concentrate or ingredients, you will need to get more information from the vendor. And remember, water is not one of the components. Now let's discuss the SFA's responsibilities. Buy American language must be added to procurement policies and procedures, as well as any solicitations, contracts, and purchase orders. The Buy American provision applies to program and non-program foods that are purchased when using the nonprofit food service account. Here in Idaho, it's the 290 Fund for Public Schools. And some of the non-program foods would be your a la carte items, perhaps your school store or vending machines. Some sample language you could put into your contract would state, we require suppliers to certify that the food product was processed in the U.S. and that over 51% of its agricultural food component by weight or volume is from the U.S. SFAs are responsible for compliance with Buy American, not the vendor, the distributor, or the state agency. This is why it is imperative that you get the proper paperwork from the vendor to ensure you are getting items that follow the Buy American requirements. The SFA must complete the Buy American exception form. Please don't hand it to the vendor. The SFA must monitor all vendors to ensure the products being delivered meet the Buy American requirements. You should check the condition of the produce. Is it domestic? Is there any damage? What is the country of origin? If it is a processed item, does it contain 51% of the domestic food? Where was it manufactured? You should also review delivery invoices or receipts to ensure the domestic food that was solicited and awarded is the food that is received. You can also add language into your contract giving you 24 hours to inspect an order. On this slide, we have a link to the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service, or AMS, weekly market report. You should be proactive when you're receiving fresh produce to see where it's coming from. The reports you generate from the market news can be used as backup documentation to attach to Buy American exception forms. You can filter and sort to find the product you are looking to procure. Look at the terminal market to see where fresh produce is coming from. What is the country of origin? How much is the cost? You can print these in Excel to make sorting easier and then attach them to your Buy American exception forms. Perhaps you'd want to put these in a binder so that if you're getting an AR, the state agency can come in and look at your exception forms for compliance. For step-by-step instructions on how to use the AMS website, go into Download Forms in My Idaho CNP in Section 18, which is Procurement, and find the Buy American Guide. On this slide is another resource called the Produce Blue Book, and the link is there on the slide. This one is easy to use as you would choose Know Your Commodity, and in this example we're going to look at avocados. There is a calendar that has seasonal availability which shows you which countries and which month the item is being grown. This could be helpful when you're creating menus to make sure you're looking for produce that's in season. Now we will look at the vendor responsibilities. Vendors should be letting the SFA know ahead of time if the items that are being delivered are non-domestic, so the SFA has a choice to either decline the item or to accept it with an exception form filled out. The vendor should offer documents that indicate the country of origin of the non-domestic items and the cost. Vendors also have access to the AMS website. Ask them for their documentation so you can include it as part of your backup. You'll want to keep records of communications between the SFA and the vendor. This could include emails and telephone calls that can be attached to the exception form. Why all of this information is important. In the recently released final rule, there is now going to be a 10% non-domestic food cost cap put on your items that you purchase that are not part of the Buy American requirements. In school year 2025-2026, the cap will be 10%. In school year 2028-2029, the cap will be 8%. And then beginning school year 2031-2032, you'll see there will be a 5% non-domestic cap. USDA will work with state agencies during this implementation to provide needed technical assistance and guidance. So stay tuned for more information. Now let's look at the Buy American exceptions. As you know, there are two exceptions for Buy American. One, when competition reveals the cost of a domestic produce is significantly higher than the non-domestic food. And two, if the domestic food is not produced or manufactured in sufficient and reasonable available quantities of a satisfactory quality. There is a useful tool out there from USDA called the Federal Acquisitions Regulations List, or the FAR. And this list pertains to one of the Buy American exceptions for produce that's not available, manufactured in the United States in sufficient and reasonably available quantities of a good quality. So when you go to the link that's on the slide, you'll want to look for the FAR and then 25.104. When you open this up, you'll find on the list items that are non-domestic, such as bananas, canned mandarin oranges, canned pineapple. The reason the FAR list is a good tool to use is because if an item is found on the list, then you would not need to fill out a Buy American exception form. As mentioned before, bananas, canned oranges, mandarin, and canned pineapple are on the FAR, so that means you would not need to fill out an annual exception form for those items. Note that fresh pineapple is not on the FAR, so you would need an exception form if it is non-domestic. The same is true for green peppers, cherry tomatoes, grapes, melons, etc. Anything that you order and that your vendor delivers that is non-domestic, you would still need to do the Buy American exception form. Non-domestic items that are on the FAR list may not need a Buy American exception form. However, they will count toward the 10% calculation cap. The non-domestic cap applies to your total commercial food costs. It does not include your USDA foods. It's only on your total commercial food costs. USDA plans to provide guidance to support SFA's implementation of the cap and tracking of expenses. It is up to the SFA to determine what sort of Buy American exception form they need to complete. Would it be for an annual reason, a seasonal exception, maybe a one-time exception? For any non-domestic item, you need to complete the whole exception form, sign it, and then attach the backup documentation with it. It may be a good time to document the cost of the non-domestic item, so when school year 2025-2026 starts, you'll be in practice of knowing how much is being spent on non-domestic items in order not to exceed the 10% cap. You will still need to justify the use of an exception, and you must keep documentation showing the cost of domestic versus non-domestic food and the quality and quantity of the domestic products that are not available. In download forms in My Idaho CNP, SFAs can find the Buy American exception form that must be filled out and filed with the backup documentation from the vendor or AMS. You may also ask your vendor if they are able to add the country of origin to your invoice. Also in the final rule, it was determined that you may now use local as a specification. When you request quotes and you're writing solicitations for bids, the product must be unprocessed or minimally processed, which means it must retain its inherent quality. The language to use in your solicitations or your request for quotes would include locally grown, locally raised, or locally caught. USDA will not define local, that's up to the program operators, and you're encouraged to adopt definitions of local that best suit the needs of your district. When you create menus, look for seasonal items, procure local produce when available, and ask the vendor if they can add local produce to the catalog. This is where the Produce Blue Book will come in handy to see what items are in season. So as locally caught, fish is part of the Buy American requirement. Wild caught and farmed fish are included, and they must be farmed and processed within the United States. Wild caught fish must be caught within the exclusive economic zone of the U.S. or by a U.S. flagged vessel, and it must be processed within the United States. If you have any questions regarding the Buy American requirements, please call the state agency at 208-332-6800.
Idaho Child Nutrition Programs is an equal opportunity provider.